Surely, at this point, you've seen Imperial Yeast's amazing selection of high-quality brewing yeasts over at imperialyeast.com. But you might not be as familiar with Imperial Yeast's special order yeast bank. In addition to their tried-and-true core strain selection, Imperial Yeast has a number of ale or lager strains, Brettanomyces, Kveik, and other yeasts available for special order. If you're looking to match a yeast strain currently in production, or just looking for something new to play with in the brew house, reach out to Imperial Yeast customer service to see what they may have in store. Special order strains are subject to a 10-liter order minimum and require a 2 to 3 week propagation time, but they might just be what you're looking for your next brew. You can get more information about Imperial Yeast's special order strains by calling 503-477-5826 or emailing customerservice@imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. Climate change is a huge problem affecting agriculture here in the U.S. and throughout the world. Being an agricultural commodity, hops are also affected by climate change. Hops, it turns out, don't do well in high heat or drought conditions, and then they also become more susceptible to diseases and pests. But not to worry, there's still hope and even things we as brewers can do to help. I'm your host, Cade Job, and today I'm back in the lab with my co-host, Jordan Folks, as we apply the learnings from last week's episode, Hops and Climate Change, with Jeff Daly and Ryan Christian.
When it comes to raw ingredients, climate change is clearly a problem for brewers. And so there's kind of two ways we as the industry can tackle it. There's both the supply side, which is really what you were all talking about last week, and then the demand side. And so I think that would be good for us to kind of take a day to talk about what can we do as brewers to reduce our demand and help, meet the supply fluctuations that we might see in the future as climate change gets, hopefully not, but maybe worse.
Yeah. I mean, I love that you say that, right? Because as we talk about global warming and climate change and how it's impacting suppliers, right, that are providing ingredients for brewers, it's important for us also to take a step back and assess how we individually can make sustainability decisions in our brewing practices. So, of course, several weeks ago, Jordan and I talked about chasing sustainability generally in brewing, and we gave a lot of options about how to incorporate sustainability decisions into your brewing practices. This week, we're going to focus on something that Jeff mentioned during the show, how Sabro can be used at one-third the level of Citra and still impart great hoppy characteristics. Why do I bring up Sabro? Well, like Jeff pointed out, reducing the amount of hops means less waste. It carries a whole lot of other sustainability benefits for growers and the entire supply chain, including brewers. So other varieties have some similar sustainability decisions tied to them, like pest-resistant varieties that have fewer CO2 emissions. But one of the things that came up is, like, how do you know how to experiment with new or different varieties? Let's say I want to switch over to Sabro. Do I just do what Jeff said and do roughly about a third? How do I go about that? It takes some trial and error. And so Jordan and I wanted to share our thoughts on how to experiment with new ingredients and how that can ultimately affect sustainability. And this won't just be a hop episode. We'll start by focusing on hops because that's what we talked about in last week's episode. But we're also going to discuss barley and yeast. So we'll pull back in some of that stuff that we talked about a few weeks ago with Harmony and Campbell. If you're not already a patron of Brülosophy, please consider becoming one. We really appreciate the support we get from our patrons. And as a reward for your support, you get access to unpublished contributor recipes, discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session. Becoming a patron is super easy. There's no obligation. You can cancel at any time, but if you're out there listening to the show, I really hope you'll check it out. This month's guest is the Brew Lab's resident sensory scientist and guest of last week's episode, Jeff Daly. As a listener of the show, you know that Jeff has incredible knowledge of hops, beer, and sensory. And so if you want ideas about how to substitute ingredients, I bet he can give you some. Also, if you're interested in learning about those advanced hop products like Incognito, Spectrum, Flex, and all those other flowable extracts, Jeff is the guy to help you with that information. So to make sure that you can attend this session, ask your questions of Jeff, you need to become a patron by visiting patreon.com/Brülosophy. Another great way to support us is by using the links at Brülosophy.com/support. There's some really cool affiliates who give us a small kickback if you purchase from their site by using one of Brülosophy's links. It doesn't change any part of your shopping experience, but it does help us out. Head over to Brülosophy.com/support to check it out. And for this week's feedback, given the topic of last week's episode and the fact that I mentioned Sabro in the intro, we should do another Sabro plug, which of course is brought to you by the dedicated crew at Haas, who bred Sabro from a Neo-Mexicana subspecies growing wild in the mountains of New Mexico. Think you know Sabro? Think again. This monster of a hop is efficient when it comes to delivering big flavor. Use less green to save more green, if you know what I mean. And if you like pina coladas and getting caught in the rain, try it in the whirlpool. It's full of aroma and chemical compounds that last from the hot side to the final glass, even if you dry hop on top of it. Sabro is known for its incredible blend of coconut, tropical, and stone fruits with a pronounced cream character with flavors of vanilla, cedar, dill, and even mint. Can't decide where to use it? No sweat. Sabro's available in all Haas hop formats to meet your brewing needs, from highly consistent Lupamax pellets to efficient Incognito and traditional T90 pellets. Learn more about this awesome variety as well as the other innovative products Haas has to offer at johnihaas.com. That's John, the letter I, Haas.com. All right, listener Paul wrote in and he said, Cade, I have a question for Jordan about his souring technique. A while back, he mentioned he'll ferment Brett beers for a year, and I'm wondering how he controls suckback or oxygen exposure. My homie hooked me up with a few glass carboys, and I'm going to fill them soon. As I'm about to brew, oxygen is terrifying me. I've looked over Milk the Funk and haven't found a good technique. Any recommendations are greatly appreciated. Paul, what do you think, Jordan?
I actually do use glass carboys and plastic carboys for fermenting and aging sour beer, so I definitely have some experience here. I will note that he says that he's interested in doing a Brett beer, and but then precedes that by asking about my souring technique. Notably, don't expect a lot of acidity to come from Brett only, but I think that the rules that we apply to these types of alternative mixed fermentation beers apply whether or not you're adding souring microbes. The key here is you want to avoid oxygen. And I gather that Brett is really one of those things that actually trigger some of that oxygen. In a mixed fermentation sour beer, we often are adding Brettanomyces in addition to lacto and pedio because pedio can throw off undesirable characteristics that Brett can really clean up. Not to mention the funk and kind of fruit that various Brett strains can bring to the table is really enjoyable and really complements a sour beer. That being said, what I'm about to say really can work as well for Brett beers that have no souring microbes. Just know that if you don't add lacto or pedio, you're not going to get that sour of a beer typically. So my advice is that when using glass carboys, you want to fill that as close to the brim as possible. So if you're doing your primary fermentation in a glass carboy, you're going to have to give yourself a couple inches to account for the fermentation kreuzen, right? You might want to use a blow-off tube, then you can get even closer. You could even use some of that non-foaming agent to mitigate some of that foaming. And then you just keep that airlock on, or if you use a blow off, swap it out once it starts to die down and leave that airlock on for 6 months or so before you start to check it out. You want to make sure that your airlock stays filled with sanitizer solution. And in a world where you do a primary fermentation first, and then you're racking off the primary into your souring carboy and adding your bugs, your Brett, your pedio, your lacto, what have you, at that point, you can really fill it basically to the brim. And again, you just want to keep that airlock filled so you're not getting any oxygen coming in that way. As long as you don't have crazy temperature swings, which I would assume most basements and like living spaces wouldn't, I'm not really concerned with oxygen suckback. And that's one of those reasons that we're just trying to mitigate it in every way we can by filling it as close to the brim as possible, which is dependent on whether or not it's primary or secondary fermentation. One last thing I'll add is they do have these bungs that you can add that off-gas a little bit, but don't let stuff in. I forget what it's called. You could probably find it on More Beer pretty easily. I have a friend that's used those to some success. The big thing with those is you have to you can't add those until the aggressive primary fermentation is over. So that might be something to consider, especially if you're using the secondary pitch technique.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't have very much to add to that. I mean, I think that's really great and comprehensive answer. The only thing I would say is like you mentioned, Jordan, suckback to me is a temperature issue, right? Like that's when I get suckback is like when I'm crashing and changing something. So like Jordan said, if you have big temperature swings, I wouldn't expect a whole lot of suckback. But what we might expect is evaporation out of the airlock, right? And so if you've got water or sanitizer or anything in there, it's going to evaporate over the year. And that's where Jordan mentioned earlier, just make sure that it's consistently got that liquid in there, right? So you may have to top it up a couple times over the year, but as long as it's got liquid in there, I wouldn't be too worried about suckback, again, as long as you're not having wild temperature changes. But yeah, I hope this works out for you, Paul, and I hope you make a great sour Brett beer out of this. All right, after this short break, we'll be back talking about how to experiment with new ingredients that might carry sustainability benefits.
One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com.
The subject of last week's episode was hops, specifically how hop growers, breeders, merchants, dealers, etc. are addressing the issue of climate change. Now, we'll get to those issues, but out of the gate, Jordan, I have to ask you Jeff's question. Are you a Citra or a Mosaic brewer?
That's like asking, do you like peanut butter or jelly? They work so well together. It's kind of unfair to separate them. But I think that I would identify as a Mosaic brewer. I think especially in a single hop setting, you mentioned some Mosaic beers on that episode. It's a beautiful single hop beer, especially when it's a good lot. And that's why they named it Mosaic, right? Is it has such a plethora of flavors and aromas inside of that hop. Check out my BIY article on the website, my Mosaic Cyclone beer. It's using all sorts of different Mosaic varieties I could get my hands on: Incognito, Spectrum, T90, Lupo Max, Whole Cone. And collectively, it creates such a complex, beautiful, almost like fruity pebbles beer. Citra, I find a little more one note. I love Citra. I use it in almost every IPA, but really is like a background supporting character. And I find Mosaic is a really good, first, front, and forward hop. And Citra is a really good blender in the background.
Yeah, it's interesting because you mentioned that Mosaic can stand alone by itself. And I mentioned some Mosaic beers, but I didn't mention also one of my other favorite beers from this brewery called Last Stand in Austin. And they do a smash with Citra, a single malt, single hop beer, which I think is just Pils malt and Citra. And that's it. And it is a fantastic IPA. It's really, really good. So I do think Citra can stand on its own. And maybe that's why I fall in that camp a little bit. I'm the Citra camp. Mosaic, to me, again, like I mentioned on the show, just sometimes has this like stinky, sweaty character to it. And I'm like, that's a Mosaic beer. And I can smell it and it hits me. And I'm like, oh, this is gross. On the flip side, Citra I've definitely described Citra as catty or like cat piss or onion garlic, as I mentioned on the show. So I can certainly see each, but it's interesting to see how you fall on that one, Jordan. Mosaic is a great one, but you certainly still brew with both hops. All right, let's talk hops and climate change then. So we talked about a lot of things with Jeff and Ryan. And one of the interesting things that I think Jeff said, but also Ryan as well. Remember, Ryan had the calculations calculating out to like 2080 how the climate in Yakima was going to change. And the long and short of that is it's going to get warmer and hotter and drier, right? But we're looking a long way in the future. And I can't remember if it was Ryan or if it was Jeff that mentioned it. It's not just getting hotter, it's these temperature swings that are causing a lot of issues, or climate swings. Like one year it might be heat and drought, and then the next year totally wet and rainy. And so the plant is having to deal with both of these things because, like Ryan said, the hops aren't moving, right, Jordan? They're not moving anywhere.
Right. That's the beauty of this plant is it comes back up every year, but that means that you kind of have to adapt to the environment around you, and that's got to be tough as a grower if it's dramatically fluctuating from year to year with pumping one year and drying it out the next. I mean, that's got to be tough.
Yeah, and all of these things ultimately lead to different issues that we have to face as brewers, right? I mean, the growers are certainly dealing with increased mite pressure and, maybe mildew or diseases in other years. But these hops that come to us might also have challenges that the growers were trying to mitigate, but maybe weren't able to cure. For example, like increased mite pressure. If you have mites growing on the hops, that means the mites are going to eat the hops. And the grower might have to pull those hops before they hit the peak aroma characteristics, right? Or they might have to pull them before they fully develop their alpha acids, if it's an alpha acid variety. All of these things make growers have to make decisions to save their crop. And for example, last year in 2023, there was with Simcoe, especially, which is one of the varieties, it started blooming a month early. And so this is crazy for a perennial hop for a perennial plant like hops. Hops generally can be harvested within like the same 5-day week, maybe 2-week window, year over year over year for the last 200 years, right? I mean, if it was planted in the same field, you could generally count on, like I mentioned, the Farmer's Almanac, the hop is going to be ready to harvest within this like week to 2-week window. And you could almost count on that. But over the last 5 or 6 years, especially, that window is changing. And for example, Simcoe last year, half of the plant started blooming early, and then the other half bloomed late. So growers were having to decide, okay, are we going to harvest now and get half yield, or are we going to let the half of the plant basically die, go old and maybe a little bit OG, but maybe get a higher yield later in the season? And so they're having to make these decisions, and ultimately that results in less Simcoe in 2023, which is kind of an interesting problem that we're now faced with. Like, we weren't in the field with the growers when this was happening, but as brewers, we are dealing with the consequences.
I'm curious on the Simcoe, was that 2022 crop or 3?
No, 2023 crop. Yeah, 2023. Yeah.
So have you brewed with Simcoe yet, or have you heard reports? I'm curious, how's the 2023 crop looking? Is it just an alpha acid issue, or are we having quality issues with Simcoe this year?
No, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. All I know is I was in the fields I was in a Citra field looking across at the Simcoe field, and you could see half the plant was ready to be harvested and half the plant had the fresh blooms on it. And so growers were having to make all of these difficult decisions. I mean, that's, again, just one example. I don't know what is going to happen to the 2023 crop for Simcoe. Maybe ultimately it's going to work out great. I know that growers were having to make decisions, and some growers were making different decisions. For example, some growers were picking the Simcoe that was ready, right? Even though half the plant was just blooming, they're picking that and going, okay, I know that this Simcoe tastes good, and I'm maybe having a 40% or a 50% yield this year, but at least I've got good Simcoe, right? So other growers are saying, hey, I'm going to wait and see what happens, because maybe if we let this plant go, all of the stuff that's dead or dying will just shatter during processing. It won't actually make it in. We might still have good Simcoe, but might get 60% yield. So who knows? I don't know exactly what that's going to do for this Simcoe crop.
Yeah, I think that Vinny listens to the podcast sometime, and I think Simcoe is the number one hop he uses. So, Vinny, if you're listening, let us know how the recent crop has been, because I love that hop, and that would be a really big bummer if the 2023 crop wasn't very good quality or was super expensive.
Yeah, that's true too. And I wonder about this as well too. We certainly have a backlog of hops that are available. There's a lot of hops sitting on the shelf right now from prior years that still haven't been sold or used. So I don't know how soon people are going to be getting to their 2023 crops. But again, this early bloom, split bloom was just one issue, and that's a unique thing, right? For Simcoe, some varieties this happens to, like Centennial that Jeff mentioned, that kind of happens. But there are other things like smoke. Jeff mentioned 2020 and 2021. 2020 hit Oregon, 2021 hit Washington, and 2022 hit Idaho. Boom, boom, boom. The 3 major U.S. hop growing regions in 3 years got blasted by smoke. And so that's a problem, and that's probably going to continue in the future. Now, last year in 2023, we had Canadian wildfires that were blowing smoke down into the Midwest and a little bit into Yakima and Idaho, and even getting as far as the Willamette Valley. So far, there hasn't been detected smoke taint in hops in 2023. But who knows? As those hops sit, is that smoke going to increase? We don't know. We also look at, there's a study that came out in 2022 from the Hallertau in Germany, which was talking about how they have a whole bunch of unirrigated fields. And when it got really hot 2 years in a row, the hops actually produced less alpha acids than normal. Now, these are, Hallertau noble hops, so they're not going to be high alpha acids anyway. But when you're talking about 4% down to maybe 1.5%, right? You're going to use a buttload more hops in the beer. That's a challenge.
I actually was going to ask you about that because the podcast was so focused on American hops. I was curious, what's going on with these low alpha acids we're seeing out of Europe? Is it simply a function of water?
Yeah, it is. It was so Europe has been getting hotter and drier, just like the rest of the world too, and it's hitting them particularly hard because they have a lot of unirrigated fields. So in the U.S., I mean, Yakima is a desert, right? It's a high desert. So if you're going to grow hops in Yakima, you got to bring water to the hops. They do that in a variety of ways. Willamette Valley is a little bit wetter, and so they don't have to irrigate as heavily as they do in Yakima, but they do still have to irrigate in the Willamette Valley to get through those dry June, July months before hop harvest. But Oregon has the flip side issue. It has, if you let the hops go into October, it's going to start raining and dumping on the hops, and then you're going to have mildew and disease pressure, right? So you've kind of got all of these issues that are happening. And I want to point out too, we talk a lot about climate change as being warmer, but that doesn't necessarily mean just that everything is getting hotter and drier. It can mean that the rains come earlier, or the rains are more vigorous whenever they come, or it rains in times that it doesn't normally rain, right? You have climate variation and variability. And this also deals with another issue, which is maturity. Climate change might be moving some of the maturity dates of these hops around. Like, for example, Simcoe dealt with that split bloom this year. That means somebody had to decide, when is that hop going to be ready to pull out of the ground. So a grower had to decide when that hop was mature, but each individual grower had to make those decisions, and they might have made different decisions. So is Simcoe going to show a lot of variability this year? All these kinds of things are real challenges that growers are dealing with, but that definitely affect brewers.
Yeah, and at the homebrew level, we don't really get to choose picking window or anything like that, let alone lot. But bigger brewers like Vinny at Russian River, they're figuring out if they like early pick, late pick, etc. And I can't remember what Vinny has said on Simcoe, but he has a preference. And so what a bummer if he happens to like late and they have to pick them all early. And so you could really see some changes into like the way that these hops actually present themselves in the finished glass.
Yeah, well, and I would imagine a grower, or a brewer like Vinny of his size is probably going to have those conversations with the grower, right? The grower's probably going to be on the phone with Vinny going, "Hey, what do you want me to do?" Right, and trying to have that conversation, or at least I hope that that's what's happening. But backing up to, we're talking about and sort of painting doom and gloom. Remember that hop suppliers like John I. Haas and like YCH have been doing this for a long time, right? And so there are ways to mitigate these issues, especially by blending fields, right? Like, and then, each lot of Citra, for example, is a blend of several fields, right? And then lots it's tested for consistency each year from lot to lot, right? So there are differences, there will be variability, but there are processes in place to ensure homogeneity. So I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that Simcoe's going to be bad this year. I'm saying that there are challenges that growers and companies like Haas and YCH had to deal with that are ultimately going to affect us. And so one of the things that we can do, like we mentioned at the top of the show, is kind of start thinking about these things as brewers, right? Brewers can be reactionary, right? You can just say, okay, the alpha acids from European varieties are lower. Okay, fine. I'm just going to use more Tettnang in my Kolsch, right? And that's a totally appropriate option. But maybe some of the other questions that we should be making are there other varieties that might also be just as good in my Kolsch, or might not change the flavor of my Kolsch, but have higher alpha acid where I can reduce waste and reduce the amount of time that I spend in a fermenter and the amount of time that I spend chilling and clarifying and all that sort of stuff. So these are sorts of questions that we need to start asking as brewers.
Yeah, so there's a variety of things that we can do in the brew house to improve efficiency given the realities at hand. And like you mentioned, perhaps you have a really low alpha variety, and at the homebrew scale, you can spend a couple more dollars. What's the big deal? But a pro brew scale, that makes a big difference, dumping pounds and pounds of hops into your lager wort when you could just use 1 pound of Magnum or something like that, right? And so, we've actually done an experiment. It's pretty old, 2016, so definitely worth revisiting, and this is definitely on my list. But we tested whether or not a high alpha versus a low alpha bittering hop could be detected sensorially in a Vienna lager, and it wasn't. Tasters were not able to reliably taste the difference. That was just one hop versus another. Maybe certain varieties would be more obvious or certain styles, but I'm not too surprised. I tend to use low alpha in European lager because I just got to be a traditionalist, but that's one of the many things that we could do to save some money and save some raw ingredient, and maybe get more or less the same product.
Yeah, for sure. That's interesting to hear that like a high alpha versus a low alpha didn't really change the flavor of the beer in bittering. That's certainly something I know you've talked about it recently, Jordan, is like as an experiment that you want to look at. I think certainly or a good one to look back at, because a lot of brewers would say that the reason they use nobles like you, Jordan, at low alpha nobles is because it imparts some sort of flavor characteristic to their lagers that they like, right? I know you're in that camp, and so it's interesting to hear. Maybe using something like Magnum or another high alpha variety might be a good way to deal with some of these issues from Hallertau having lower alpha.
Exactly. And, maybe a finishing hop, you're going to start to taste the differences there. But when it comes to bittering, and, you can kind of like mix and match too. That's something I've been thinking about is I have like just a few ounces of Satz left, and it's just not enough on its own. And the idea of me making a Czech lager using like American hops is just like horrifying. But I was thinking maybe I could like bitter with Mount Hood and then use the remaining Satz that I have for the kind of the later edition hop additions, because when using different hop varieties, I think you're going to start to be more likely to taste the difference once you start to get towards the end of the boil.
Yeah. I think that's true too. The closer that you get towards the end of the boil, the more of the aroma is going to stick around, and hops are definitely going to have different aroma. Now, that's something we're going to talk about here in just a few minutes, is like trying to match aromas, because I think that's pretty challenging, and we'll spend a good amount of time talking about that. But I wanted to also mention something too while we're on this alpha, alpha substitution, right? Remember that from a scientific perspective, alpha acids are going to convert to isomerized alpha acids, and there are calculations that you can put in. There's calculators all over the internet that are going to show you if I add this percentage of alpha acids at 60% of the boil, this is the amount of bitterness that I'm going to have at the end of the boil, right? So it is possible to do a substitution of alpha acids, setting aside the question of, are there also going to be aromatic contributions. The earlier and earlier in the boil you go, I think those aromatic contributions are less and less, and something that you don't have to worry about. So yeah, maybe using Magnum at 60 minutes instead of Tettnang at 60 minutes might be a real reasonable option that you can do as a brewer. One other comment on that real quick is that there are seasonal variations in hops, okay? So remember that when you get a new lot of hops, you need to change your brewing software to update the alpha acids that are in the hop that you're actually using. This is especially a big deal for brewers, especially home brewers that are using like 1 ounce, right? You got a 1 ounce pack, and you're using a 1 ounce pack of Hallertau and putting that into the boil. If the alpha acids in your software, which is probably programmed 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe even 10 years ago, says that those that Tettnang is 5.5% and the package that you have is 2%, that's going to be very different, right? So you need to take into account these things whenever you're brewing. For brewers that are using pounds of hops, that is a little bit less of a concern, because once you put it in your system, it's there, and then you use it until it's done, and then when you get the new package, you just update your system. But these are things that you need to take be considerate of. Now, that's sort of an alpha acid way to look at this, but there are other characteristics that we prize hops for, like Whirlpool editions, dry hop editions. We're looking for aroma. So I wanted to talk about, how we deal with, maybe changing the aroma of a hop. And I think one way that most brewers have done this, and you probably have done this before too, Jordan, is you go to brew an IPA and you realize you don't have the hop that you need, right? And so you go, crap, am I going to run down the store and go get this variety? Or if I'm not close close to a homebrew store. What am I going to do? What have you done in those situations, Jordan? Or have you ever been confronted with that situation, or are you a better planner than I am?
No, I'm definitely a brewer of convenience, and I just kind of look at what I have and what can I make, right? But I'm stocking stuff, some different malts and some different hops and some different yeasts, and that way I can brew a couple times a month and make different types of beers. And so, it's actually happened to me recently. Remember when we did the 100th episode and we tasted that unicorn beer from Breakside?
Yeah.
It really blew me away, and it had this kind of gummy bear, white gummy bear character that I really loved. And I recently brewed a cold IPA. It was my first cold IPA, actually. And I was like, why don't I try to be inspired by that beer? And I looked at the hops that they had, and it was like Galaxy, Comet, and Cascade or something. I can't remember the third one. I'm sorry. But I had none of them. So I just went to, no, one of them was El Dorado. I remember that. And I had some El Dorado incognito oil, but the other ones I didn't have. And so I got on the internet and looked at what are the substitution recommendations. And so for the Galaxy, I used Nectaron. And for the Comet, I used Strata. And, so just trying to piece together, what are kind of the closest links that I have in my brew house? And this beer rocks, dude. It's so nice. Good. And if it wasn't for being inspired by this other beer, but then trying to figure out the hop substitutions that I could use on hand, I never would have discovered this combo of Nectaron, Citra, Strata, and El Dorado Incognito. It's a great cold IPA.
It sounds like a fantastic combo. And, that's something that's interesting, too. When you've got a beer that's using 3 or 4 different hops, it might be easier to substitute, right? Than if you're doing, like we talked about earlier, if you're using your single hop Mosaic, it might be tough to substitute a hop that's going to taste just like Mosaic. And now, again, as a home brewer, we don't have to worry if this batch tastes exactly the same as the last batch, as long as it's good, right? We can be trying to make the same batch. But as a brewer, if you release Mosaic IPA and then you don't have Mosaic to brew with, that's going to be a problem, right? And that's going to be a big challenge for your brewery. But there are other hops, like you mentioned Comet and how Strata was a good substitute, right? For Comet in this beer, where you had these 4. There's another one that I think of a lot, and this is kind of harkens back to an episode that I did a while back with Ryan Gregory when we were talking about how different hops have different CO2 emissions, right? And he actually went through a whole bunch of Hopsteiner hops and created a chart of which hops had the highest CO2 emissions and which ones had the least CO2 emissions. And Cashmere was the U.S. hop that had the most CO2 equivalent emissions. And so I started thinking about Cashmere to me has always tasted like really onion garlicky, but to a lot of people it's lime, and it's put in beer to have this lime characteristic. And I was thinking, wow, okay, Cashmere could be one of those hops that you could decide, I don't want to brew with Cashmere anymore, not because it's not available or I can't find it, but because it's one of the hops that's really contributing to high CO2 emissions. How would I go about changing that? That's sort of interesting. What am I looking for? And I think, like you, Jordan, I would go to the internet, try to see what flavors match, and see if I could find a hop that has similar aromatic profile.
And what's funny about that is thinking of modern American hops, there's 2 that really stick out to me that I detest the most. And there's not that there's anything wrong with that, and it's okay that people like them. It just doesn't work for my palate. And one of them happens to be very unsustainable, Cashmere. But the other is one of the most sustainable hops out there, Sabro. I do not like this hop, and I'm so stoked that people like it. And I think that, and we've heard this before on the podcast, is that people have been too heavy-handed with Sabro. So I'm willing to believe that there is a world in which a deft hand can make a really good beer using Sabro as like a background note. But maybe you can talk a little bit about that this hop is just so potent that to me it's kind of overpowering in the usage rates I'm seeing. But maybe we don't need to be using as much Sabro in the first place, and that's really a big sustainability benefit of that hop.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think this is one of what Jeff was talking about whenever he was talking about the sustainability benefit of Sabro, is that you can use a lot less of it. And of course, Ryan mentioned as well, and Jeff as well too, but it's a high yielding hop, which is great for growers. That means, awesome, this is a plant that has some disease resistance, has some heat tolerance, it has high yielding, and it has great aroma profiles. I say great because I love Sabro. I think it's actually a really good hop. I actually really like Sabro. I think it's becoming one of my favorite hops to brew with. But in any event, the sustainability benefit is that you can use less. And I think that you're totally right, Jeff. And I think, Jordan, and I think Jeff mentioned that on the podcast, right? Which is sort of, people are probably using too much Sabro. They're taking it and saying, okay, I'm going to substitute it for Citra, and doing a 1-to-1 substitution, and it's coming out grassy or like oniony or like, who knows, like something that's just weird or off because there's so much in the beer. I mean, that's at least been my experience.
I get suntan lotion. And I swear that hop has a mouthfeel to it. Maybe because it's so frequently paired with hazy IPAs, but it's like, it is just too much. But I really do think that maybe I just haven't had the right Sabro beer. So maybe next Yakima Valley Hop Sorter, I need to get some and really start to play with it, because I don't even know if I've actually brewed with it. It's just, something about Neo-Mexicanus varieties, it doesn't work for me. And both of those, I believe, are Neo-Mexicanus.
Yeah, definitely. And maybe there's something about those hops that I really like. I'm not a big fan of hop burn. So, definitely too much hops, I definitely don't like it. And I've been burned a number of times drinking IPAs with too much hop in it. And maybe Sabro, I don't think Sabro's been a part of any of those, but you never know. But so this kind of begs the question then, Jordan, and I want to talk about this for a minute or two, is like, how do we know how much to use, right? Let's say that you went on the internet and you were trying to replace Citra and it said, hey, replace it with Sabro. And then you're trying to figure out, okay, how much do I put in my beer? How do you go about doing that?
That is one of the most challenging things about brewing, is it really takes a lot of trial and error. I remember when I first started brewing, the whole prospect of which malts to use was really intimidating, because you're like, Munich malt, that's a city in Germany. What does Munich taste like? Like you don't know what SRM is, right? And right. Let alone the unique flavor contributions that malt brings, and hops are the same way. This hobby or profession takes a lot of experience to really become a master of all of these, complex ingredients. We've been cooking and eating food our whole lives, so we kind of understand salt and pepper. But professional chefs that really go deep in spices, that's really where you start to unlock amazing, beautiful foods and beverages. And so to answer your question, unfortunately, the answer is probably experience. Hopefully that will change. And I mean, it would be amazing if there was some sort of calculator where it was like, okay, the best mimic for Citra is 1 part Mosaic, 1 part Strata, 1 part Simcoe, or whatever it may be, right? Not recommending that that's actually the replacement ratio, but there's probably some way to figure that out mathematically. And granted, it would change from year to year and lot to lot, but there could be some rules of thumbs, and that'd be some cool research to develop, calculators, etc. And if anyone knows of anything out there that we don't know of, please let us know, because I would love to see a more nuanced substitution chart that's actually getting into blending to achieve a similar effect.
Yeah, this was a really cool episode that I talked about. Actually, another one with Jeff Daly, but it was also with Julia Jennings, Dr. Julia Jennings, who's the analytical chemist at Haas. And we talked about how Julia was trying to do this, essentially. She was trying to map what is the flavor profile of these hops. And if I just look at the chemical compounds that we know are responsible for some of these aromas, can I then just say, okay, Citra has 20%, or not 20%, Citra has like 0.5%, I don't know, linalool or something, or citronellol or something that's like really, really is citrusy. I don't know the exact compounds that would lead to those, but she was trying to match that, and it was really difficult. It was impossible, because there's like hundreds of compounds in hops that are responsible for aroma, and especially some of them that aren't at noticeable percentages. Like, for example, thiols. If you're just measuring those, like in most, regular applications, you're not going to get to the levels that you need for thiols. It takes actually really, really advanced equipment. to get down to the levels that thiols at. I mean, I remember that Cecile Chenot, on the episode where we talked about thiols, mentioned that one drop of thiols, one drop in an Olympic-sized swimming pool is aromatically noticeable. And, so you're thinking about like, holy moly, that's one of those compounds that is very, very, very potent and probably a big driver of citrus and Sabro and some of these other, especially like American varieties of hops. They're very, very low concentrations. So can you just make and put an aromatic profile on another? And ultimately the takeaway from Jeff and Julia's research on that was, we're not quite there yet. We'd like to be, and maybe we can be in the future. But as of right now, nothing really does the job other than our noses. And like you said, trial, error, and expense and experience.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure AI will figure it out in the next week, but
there we go. I need to send that. We need to suggest that to Julia. Say, you just need to run it through some AI, and then we'll figure it out.
Yeah, right. Well, I think one thing that you mentioned there, the thiol, also makes me realize that there are probably some non-beer ingredients that we could use in brewing applications that could help mimic traditional beer ingredients, malt, hops, yeast, water. Maybe not water, but you would think that what's the new Krenza grain?
Oh, Kernza, yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. Like that's like a new, what do you call it? Heritage grain, or it's not barley, but it's
it's my understanding, and I actually don't know a lot about Kernza. I need to get him on the podcast to talk about it. But my understanding is it's a blend. It's like it's a heritage. No, actually, I really don't know. I don't know much about it. I wish I did.
No, it's a grain, but it's not barley, it's not wheat, it's Kernza or whatever. It's a different species, but and maybe that's not the best example because it's still a malted grain, but drawing from more sustainable ingredients that aren't the standards, right? So, for example, when it comes to bound thiols, there are other ways in which you can get sort of hop-esque compounds by unlocking and releasing those thiols, like mash hopping with a thiolized yeast strain from Omega, or maybe even something like coriander, I think, is high in bound thiols. And so there might be some more sustainable, non-traditional beer ingredients we could use to get beer-like flavors. I mean, heck, they were using all sorts of weird stuff in beers before hops were even used. And so there might be some non-hop plants that could have similar levels of bitterness or, interesting fruity aromatics, etc. Who knows what's out there that that's right under our noses in our spice cabinet.
Oh, totally. I mean, non-traditional beer ingredients like that, like spices or different aromatics, botanicals, extracts are things that we can put into beer to improve flavor. I'm sure there's lime and lemon extracts if you wanted to increase citrus character. Who knows if those are expensive or, usable, and how you feel about adding, non-traditional beer ingredients. But then there's also, of course, the advanced hop products like Incognito, Spectrum, Flex, some of these flowable, extracts that are usable, that help from a sustainability perspective of a brewer, in that you don't have all that plant material that goes into it. So from a yield perspective from a brewer, that's great because that allows you to sell more beer. You don't have to use you don't have as much effluent, right? Like waste that's going down the drain. And remember that hops material and yeast is something that when you pour that down the drain, somebody still has to do something with it. It goes to a wastewater treatment facility and it has to be dealt with there. So by removing that plant material, you reduce the load on that wastewater facility, which also has increased sustainability implications, right? So all of these things, all of these different, like you said, non-traditional ingredients, advanced products are also options for sustainability choices when substituting hops.
Right. And I think that maybe one way to take this all home is that you're not having to necessarily make a trade-off, right? I've been using Incognito and Spectrum, and I swear I'm making the best IPAs of my life. These products are incredible, and it's not a sacrifice, it's an improvement. So we're netting more beer, and we're making better beer. And so I think that that's what's really interesting about a lot of these new varieties that are being developed is, sure, they were trying to make disease-resistant or high-alpha varieties, etc., but they've discovered some of the most amazing aromatic, citrusy, fruity varieties known to man. Citra and Mosaic, like they mentioned, these weren't developed to be the next IPA hop inherently. They were made to be agronomically, solid. And it turns out these are some of the most beautiful hops we've ever discovered in the world. And so I love that we're making things more sustainable and making better beer at the same time.
Well, that's true. And I mean, we talked about it several months back, and you already brought up Vinny on the show, but Pliny the Elder is made with extracts, right? Those advanced product extracts, which is amazing, right? That's an incredible beer that's made with, these advanced products. So there are beers out there, and like you just mentioned, brewers that are making fantastic beers using some of these products already that are having, sustainability implications down the road. All right, well, let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to switch over to malt and yeast and talk about how we can substitute malt and yeast to make sustainability decisions.
We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brülosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
Established in 1995, More Beer has been consistently serving the greater brewing community since the times IPA was expected to be bitter and clear, and there are reasons they've stuck around so long. In addition to their massive product selection and excellent customer service, More Beer has locations on both the west and the east coast of the United States, which translates into fast shipping times regardless of where you live. And when you spend more than $59, shipping is free. When you're in need of brewing ingredients and gear, there's no better option than morebeer.com, one of the most trusted shops on the planet.
At Planet Fitness, Leap Day means an extra day of energy. And who doesn't love energy? To celebrate, now through February 29th, you can join for 29 cents down, $10 a month, and pay nothing until March 17th. Even better, you'll get free fitness training and equipment for every workout, with most clubs open 24 hours. So take advantage of your extra day and get energized at Planet Fitness. Join for 29 cents down, $10 a month, cancel anytime, and pay nothing until March 17th. Deal ends February 29th. See Home Club for details.
As an agricultural commodity, hops are certainly impacted by climate change, and so is barley, which we talked about a few weeks back. But what about yeast? Are there climate implications associated with yeast, Jordan?
Well, I mean, there's probably a climate implication associated with everything, so I'm going to say yes.
Yeah, I think so too, right? I mean, it's not as obvious that there would be climate implications associated with yeast, but yeast does one really cool thing that we like, which is turn sugar into alcohol and CO2. Right? And CO2 emissions are a big deal. And for a lot of breweries, we're not collecting any of that CO2 that's just bubbling off, right? It's not like that's going like straight to, gas that's causing, or global warming, but it is impacting, right? I mean, I don't know that the CO2 from fermentation is having a huge impact on global warming. Let me be very, very clear about that. Maybe it is. I don't know. I'd be interested if there's a study out there. Somebody send it in. That'd be a great feedback to show. But we're certainly blowing off a whole bunch of CO2. And then we put CO2 back in the beer whenever we carbonate it, right? And so there's this, it's all the same thing too. And I've talked about it on other episodes with water usage, right? Like I think malting, we talked about it on the barley episode. I always think it's crazy that we grow this grain from the ground. And we put a whole bunch of water onto the ground to grow the grain. And then the grain grows up. And then we dry it, right? We like dry it out, then ship it over to the malting company, let it steep in water for, several days, and then dry it again, and then ship it to the brewery, and then put it in a mash where we put more water to rehydrate it again, and then drain all that off, and then just throw away all the water that's still in the grain. It's like so water inefficient, the process is, but back to yeast, there's this same situation here, right? We use CO2 in different parts of the brew house, and we could even use CO2 to scrub some of our water to make like deaerated water. Well, there's all kinds of opportunities and use for CO2 collection. Is that a yeast issue? Yeah, sure, right? I mean, I don't know that yeasts produce different amount of CO2, but there's certainly options and of things that we can do to harness that fermentation process.
Right. I would imagine that there actually is variation in the amount of CO2 produced. Have you ever fermented a Hefeweizen? Those things are exploding out of the fermenter, right?
Right.
And so one would think, and I'm just guessing here, that there is more vigorous fermentations are associated with more CO2 production. So really cool story. I was in a webinar about a new study that's taking place in California in the world that I work in, energy efficiency, and it's for breweries. And I was like, oh my gosh, I want to know more about this. Energy efficiency research experiments and beer. I'm in.
Yeah.
And so they're gonna they have this like hyper efficient boiler, and they said that it can retrofit any type of hot side system. So even direct fire could be retrofitted to use this hyper efficient boiler. And there's going to be incentives, and the participating breweries will get a check to offset the cost. And they said it was a 3-year ROI for this new boiler. So I mean that's a no brainer in terms of reducing natural gas usage. It's a natural gas efficiency project. But coming to CO2, there was another thing they were going to do, and they're actually going to capture the CO2 that off gases from the flue of the natural gas boiler, and they're going to scrub that and collect some sort of chemical that's used in soap production and sell that chemical that it scrubs out of the CO2 to soap producers. And so it's like there are so many opportunities when it comes to CO2. And so I asked, can we attach this to the fermenter and actually make the soap stuff out of the fermentation CO2? And the engineer on the project said there's actually not enough CO2 being off-gassed via fermentation to actually use this process to scrub it. So maybe we can't collect it in that regard, but there are brewers that are collecting their CO2 to carbonate beer or push stuff around. And at the homebrew level, we can totally do that ourselves. And I know that we've talked a lot about purging serving kegs with fermentation CO2. One thing I've thought about is like a quasi-infinite loop where you always have an empty keg to receive the off-gassing CO2 that you're using in the home brewery to push things around. And you could just connect a jumper cable from keg to either capture or use the CO2 to push things around. So I think even at the homebrew level, we're wasting a lot of CO2, and there's probably a lot of opportunity there. But it turns out maybe the technology isn't ready to scrub it.
Yeah, sure, right? We can't be selling our CO2 to soap producers yet, but maybe we're going to get there in someday. That's a really cool application. Also, two really cool applications there, right? The hyper efficiency boiler, which would be really cool for any brewers out there listening to it. That sounds like a really cool technology, especially with a 3-year ROI. That's pretty amazing. But there are breweries, like you said, that are collecting their CO2. And again, there may not be enough CO2 produced to scrub for the soap, but there definitely is enough CO2, like you said, to do things like pushing things around the brewery or to carbonate, other beers, or to, sanitize and pressurize, like pressurizing bright tanks. I'm sure there's enough CO2 on a fermentation that you could use that to carbonate or to at least purge a bright tank before you put the beer in there under pressure. All of these options are, sustainability focused. That's CO2 collection. But there are also interesting new things that GMO yeasts are tackling, and one of them is interesting to me. It's like diacetyl. We've seen these diacetyl knockout strains, or strains that don't produce diacetyl. I mean, the strains do still produce diacetyl. They just produced a whole bunch of the alpha-acetylactate decarboxylase enzyme. It gets excreted out of the yeast, and then it breaks down the diacetyl almost immediately so that the diacetyl doesn't stay up in the beer. It doesn't stay in the beer. It is essentially a way to reduce the amount of diacetyl that remains in the beer. And that's a big deal because diacetyl, we talked about with John Palmer, is one of the points that we let beer set around for fermentation or for maturation, right? Once a fermentation is done, then we still have to mature the beer. We have to get rid of acetaldehyde and diacetyl. Those are the two major off flavors. That beer is sitting around being cooled, right, in a fermenter. It's also taking up space in a fermenter, right? And there are potential energy savings by reducing the fermentation time, right? If you can get that beer out of that fermenter and over into a bright tank and into a package, or from a homebrew perspective, if you don't have to let your freezer freeze, or chill for that extra time, you can just go ahead and rack that beer over. That's pretty nice. You don't have to have that kegerator or freezer running while you're fermenting. These are cool energy savings for a new GMO yeast that knocks out diacetyl.
Yeah, and there's also some ingredient savings here and raw material savings, because the diacetyl knockout strains carry that potential throughout the lifespan of the yeast, right? However, ALDC, an exogenous enzyme, you have to use that every single pitch. Now, I've only used ALDC. I use it religiously in like every beer at this point, but I would love to start messing around with some of these knockout strains, because that's great. It's one less ingredient we have to add, and that's the beauty of yeast, is it makes more with every fermentation. And so we're basically making free ALDC with every fermentation. So I think there's a lot of really interesting environmental benefits with these GMO'd strains, and not to mention, no more dumped beer. No more batches of diacetyl bombs that have to go down the drain because they won't sell, or because you're a home brewer that's, doesn't want to drink a D-bomb.
That's exactly right. And there were, I think back, like way back to episode, I think it was like 10 or 11, where I talked with Luke Chadwick about using hops to bottle condition, right? And that's a cool idea, because this hop creep phenomenon, right? When you add hops to beer, it's going to release some dextrins, and then you could potentially use it to bottle condition. And so he was exploring this. He was looking at it at Bell's Brewery going, hey, can we bottle condition with hops? Can we just put some hops in a bottle and then pour the beer onto that and bottle condition? And yes, you can. The pressure wasn't an issue. It got to the carbonation levels that they needed in the bottle, but it was a diacetyl bomb because the yeast was producing diacetyl and not able to clean it up in the bottle.
But wouldn't you not want hot matter at the bottom of your bottle? And I would be worried about nucleation sites and creating gushers.
Sure, he didn't have any gusher problems as far as I know. But again, that'd be something interesting to ask. At this time, we weren't talking about, strains with diacetyl, with diacetyl knockouts, right? We were just talking about, it's a diacetyl bomb, so it's pretty much the end of the story, right? You're not gonna do it because nobody wants a butter IPA. Well, maybe some people do, but most people don't want a butter IPA. But that's an interesting question, right? Also, there are already yeast sediment in the bottom of bottle conditioned beers, and a lot of people don't want to do that. So as long as you're not disturbing that sediment, I don't think there's going to be hop material in the beer. Once it all settles out, then you might have a clear beer without disturbing that bottom sediment, and you might be able to skip the step of adding yeast. You don't have to worry about priming sugar or yeast. You might be able to just add hops, and that might clear up your beer and freshen it just enough to bottle condition. So fewer ingredients, and also potentially less exposure to oxygen, because then you don't have to worry about sugar and yeast and all that other stuff.
Well, I can one-up you. We can skip the hop in the bottle, and we can just package early and effectively spund in the bottle, completing fermentation with the raw ingredient. That's what the Belgian brewers are doing. They're not adding bottling sugar. They're blending in young beer. And I've done it before, and if you can time it right, it's really cool to go early. But just look at diacetyl, right? You need to have the right type of beer to do that, or you need to be using the right type of yeast, and obviously do your forced fermentation tests, etc. But it is possible to bottle and carbonate without any exogenous materials whatsoever. You just got to time it right.
Yeah. Timing is going to be the interesting issue there, right? That's going to be the challenge. And so we talked about with hops, like if you're trying to substitute hops that are, used in a bittering or versus used in aroma. Have you ever brewed a beer where you had to substitute the yeast strain from one that you didn't want to brew with? I haven't actually had this situation, because generally yeast is one of the things I always make sure that I have for the beer, right? I don't generally go like, well, sometimes I'll brew a beer that I have this yeast on hand, and that's often how I'll decide what beer I'm brewing, right? Is because I have this yeast on hand. It's very rare that I'm like, okay, I'm brewing this beer, and then I get down to it and I'm like, crap, I don't have yeast. That just doesn't happen to me very often. Maybe it's the way that my brain works, or the way that I think about brewing, because I generally always start with the yeast. But have you ever had to substitute yeast, or like try to pick a different yeast for a beer, for whatever reason?
All the time.
All the time.
Like, oh yeah, it's like, well, for example, Pilgrimage is my favorite. Back in the day, 2206 from Y Yeast, which Imperial released once, I think, as a seasonal, like 10 years ago, is Fest. Those are my two favorite lager strains, and they're not always available. So if they're not, I use Global, and it's okay. I don't know that I would use Global instead of Urkel on a trying to make a Czech lager with a German yeast strain, or I definitely wouldn't use a Saison yeast when trying to make a Czech dark lager or whatever like that. But I'm totally comfortable going within the realm of reason. If it's like classic German lager strain A versus classic German lager strain B. Yeah. I kind of like a house yeast approach. So now my house yeast strain has been Pilgrimage, and just all my ales, I'm fermenting at about 60 degrees Fahrenheit with that, and all my lagers about 46 or so Fahrenheit. But there was a time at the beginning of the pandemic where I was like doing a lot of stuff with Dieter. So designing IPAs with Dieter, designing Kolsch's with Dieter, and then if I wanted a true lager, I'd use lager yeast. And so I will frequently kind of hone in on a strain and just push it to the limit. I even made a hazy IPA with Dieter because they say that this Kolsch strain has biotransformation capabilities. Didn't love it, actually. And I know there are hazy brewers out there that use it, but for me, it just juice, London Ale 3, that's the sweet stuff. That's the juice. And so that one didn't work in my favor, in my opinion, but all the time I'm, kind of making a decision on the fly and like, yeah, it's close enough. It'll be great.
It's close enough. I mean, that's a good point about yeast strains not being available, right? That's a big deal and sometimes happens, especially like you said, with yeast strains that you really like Pilgrimage or Fest. Those strains aren't always available, and so you need to find strains that you can do to substitute those. So how did you substitute with Pilgrimage? Are you really just kind of going like, it'll be fine, I'm not too worried about it? Or are you doing research? Did you do yeast screenings? Like how, you've reached a level, it seems, with your experience where you're comfortable in switching between yeast. But was there like a process that you got to at this point, or is it just years and years of brewing?
A little bit of both. I think, you got to understand what a strain offers, right? And so clearly you're not going to substitute a POF positive yeast for a super clean neutral lager yeast or something like that. So I'm just kind of thinking, what's neutral, what's available, what in this case, like Germanic, right? I'm sure you could make fantastic Helles with a Cade Bueno Mexican lager yeast strain. I wouldn't start there, but I wouldn't be afraid to use it if it was the only thing in the fridge. So trying to think kind of regionally, but I'm actually facing this situation right now. I recently brewed my last run with Pilgrimage that I've been using from batch to batch, and I used Incognito in the dip hop, which goes in the fermenter with the yeast, effectively contaminating the yeast with a bunch of oil, right? So I threw it away, and I realized, oh crap, I'm out of Pilgrimage. And I think that its quarter of seasonal strain has just ended, because when I was at the homebrew store, I saw Huga, and that was a seasonal previously, so I assume that's the current seasonal. So I'm assuming when I come to buy some more yeast, there won't be any Pilgrimage available. So given that, I'm just going to do Global. I know you're not a huge fan of it, but it's clean, it's good enough. Love Pilgrimage, but I will brew great beer with Global in the meantime.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of Global. I don't like it all that much, but for different reasons. I like Harvest a lot better, and a lot of people don't like Harvest.
Two estery.
Yeah, to estery, exactly. But it's one of those beers that I like. It's interesting though that I as I look back at like Brülosophy experiments, anytime we do yeast comparisons, it almost seems like they're always different, right? Like if you're changing, the fermentation temperatures and that stuff, sure, you can do like warm fermented Cade Bueno and all that stuff. And that might be different than cold fermented Cade Bueno. But it seems like we've never, at least not off the top of my head, and I could be totally wrong out of this, but it doesn't ever seem like, it seems like, especially I'm thinking of Chico, like when we substitute US-05 with Chico, which again are not the same, by the way, as we now know, but these clean lager strains, they actually produce significantly different beers, like sensorially different beers. So if I'm trying to substitute yeast, it seems like to me that would be very difficult to do. I mean, yeah, sure, the beer probably still tastes good switching with, I'm not going to use Global, but say Pilgrimage and Harvest. The beer would probably still taste good. That's not to say that Global is bad. I just don't like it, right? Right. So I wouldn't switch with Global. I'd switch with Harvest. But switching between Pilgrimage and either of those two yeast strains, it's not going to produce a bad beer. But in my opinion, it's probably not going to be the same beer.
Yeah, and so, it's horseshoes and hand grenades, right? We're just trying to get close enough here, and that's the beauty of homebrewing, right? Is the batch that we make today could be a little different from the one last time, and hopefully it's better. Pro brewers, I could see the concern, but listening to Pro Brewer podcast, you'll hear them talk about switching some lager strains up sometimes, and Budweiser probably wouldn't, but a smaller craft brewery can probably get away with it. But again, I think that you're just trying to get as close as you can. Don't try to substitute German strains for Czech strains. Don't try to substitute, English strains for American strains. There are some regional differences in the characters that they produce, but if you can find a strain from a similar region, you might have a similar effect. Belgian strains, I think that's probably going to have some of the greatest variation, that a Trappist strain is going to taste different than a, Saison strain and stuff like that. But even then, you're in the ballpark, and if it's homebrew, it could still be pretty good.
Oh man, we should have spent some more time talking about this, because I feel like I'm like, oh gosh, because every time I brew with a different strain, I'm like, wow, that's totally different. Like Dieter is totally different than some of the other strains. I'm like, oh man, this beer tastes wildly different. It's still great, but it's wildly different. So I would think it'd be really hard if you were trying to decide, trying to make some yeast decisions based on like sustainability issues. It'd be really hard to substitute one for one. You might have to just change things up a little bit. I wish we could spend some more time talking about that, but we got to get to malt before the end of the show. And so malt is one of the things that we talked about with that episode with Campbell Morrissey from Freem and Harmony Bettenhausen from Hartwick. And we went into a little bit of detail with malt and how we would deal with that from a sustainability issue. But what I wanted to focus on here, Jordan, is if we're trying to substitute malt, like if we're trying to make sustainability decisions with malt, how would we go about doing that? And one of the things that Campbell mentioned on the show was local suppliers actually impact the overall barley supply chain, right? And so if you can buy local, it actually helps overall global barley supply in that you've now, purchased locally because you can get that local malt. It doesn't have to be shipped, so it doesn't have to be processed in a different location. It can be processed in the local area, and you reduce transportation costs. You're also giving back to your local environment and community and all of these things. It has these kind of like compounding benefits for using local supply. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and I think that the implication there is you're creating a market, right? Because if just one guy's making one little plot and then one guy buys it, it's like, okay, but then the next brewer wants it, right? And then the next farm's like, well, great, well, I'll brew it too. And I thought that was interesting, or malt it, grow it too. I thought that was interesting, like talking about like trains. Like they need the infrastructure of trains to get it around and stuff. And so you got to have the infrastructure. So you have to have the market, you have to have the demand to make that work. Now, when it comes to substituting malt, I think that you got to think about the gestalt of the beer, right? And so malt is the number one ingredient that you're using in terms of by volume, by weight, right? In an IPA, it might not, it could actually, hops could be the costliest ingredient. But in a lot of beers like lager, malt's going to be your costliest ingredient in terms of the actual number. Per gram, maybe yeast is more expensive, but you're using less, right? So if you wanted to make a Czech pale lager and you used USO5, and you used Cascade, and you used 2-row malt, that's not going to taste like a Czech pale lager, right? So
right, totally.
Thinking about the volume of the ingredients that we're using and the sustainability implications there, you could use authentic ingredients for those that use the smallest amounts. So you could use Czech Satz hops. You could use Czech sourced yeast that's grown in America. So there's a sustainability benefit there, like the Urkel strain from Imperial. And then you could use local malts. And so it's just one of the three main ingredients. Well, heck, there's water, right? Then you could use a Czech style water profile that's going to really mimic that type of style. And then you only have one of the things in there that's not the style that you're intending. And so, maybe if you want the most authentic tasting Czech beer, you need to use all 4 of those ingredients. But I did an experiment on it. It was a Czech pale lager, and I could not taste the difference between Czech malt and Idaho Pilsner. And they were both great beers. And I'm sure that there are American malts out there that I would have been able to tell the difference. But I think that using the Czech hops and using the Czech yeast, it got me 2/3 of the way there. And so I think that's something to consider is if malt is where you're chasing sustainability, make the sacrifice there first and see if you can use more direct analogs on the yeast and the hop side.
Yeah, you make a really good point about malt being like the biggest, volume and weight ingredient in beer. And I think even in IPAs, you're still using a huge amount of malt, to make the beer. And so I think you do have opportunities here, especially to help on the margins, right? And to not like totally revolutionarily change your beer. Like if you're substituting Cashmere and Sabro in a Smash IPA, that might taste totally different, right? But substituting pale malt and Pils malt in a Smash IPA, maybe not, right? We've done some experiments that suggest that, pale and Pils malt actually don't taste that different whenever you brew with them. Maybe there's a little bit of a color difference, but who knows, And so I think malt might be a little bit more forgiving whenever we're talking about substitutions. I think for 2 reasons. One, because there may not be a huge difference between, for example, pale and Pils malt. There's certainly going to be a big difference between like caramel malt and Pilsner malt, right? I hope that's obvious for most of the listeners. But you also have you can change percentages, right? You don't have to do 100% Pilsner malt. You could do 75% Pilsner malt and 25% pale malt from your local supplier, or vice versa, right? If you're trying to do an IPA or trying to make some contribute to local suppliers or whatever it is that you're trying to do. Another thing that we talked about with Campbell and Harmony is winter barley varieties. And this is becoming a really big deal. It was kind of Pat Hayes's, I would say, mark on the brewing industry. He's now retired, but it was his mark on the brewing industry was to create winter barley varieties. Winter barleys are great from a sustainability perspective. Now, as home brewers, we probably don't have the ability to make sure that we're using winter barley varieties. And in fact, I don't know that you could even get that information from your home brewer supply store if you tried to, right? Like if you went to your home brew supply and said, hey, I want to brew with a winter barley, they're probably just going to look at you like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like it's barley varieties. I may be wrong, but it would be really cool if you could get access to winter barley varieties and choose those. And you don't have to do like 100% switch over to winter barley. You could start with a percentage switch in your malt bill.
Now, is there one malt that we would know the difference, which would be red versus white wheat? Isn't that a function of when it's harvested or grown?
I actually don't know. Maybe potentially that could be an issue, or although I don't know. I've switched between red and white, but for my Kolsch, I generally do red wheat. I liked that better than the white wheat malt. So that's an interesting point. I haven't really thought deeply about that.
Yeah, well, you're going to have to look that up because this is your job. Because I thought that I heard that the difference between red and white wheat was one was a winter variety. And if that's the case, then that would clearly present a color-coded rubric for choosing a winter malted wheat.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. Maybe that is the case. I need to look that up. And see. But that's a great opportunity, great example, right? To the extent that you can do that, maybe it is interesting to pick, the winter wheat variety or the winter barley variety, so that you can sort of achieve some of these sustainability goals. Now, I wanted one more thing to mention was, how do you know if the malt is going to taste the same? Well, you can brew a whole beer and trial and error it, but there is also an ASBC hot steep barley method that is allegedly supposed to help you determine if there are differences between two malts. And it's pretty easy. Anybody can do it at home. It just requires like a little coffee grinder and some filters, which can be coffee filters. You just grind up the malt, run some hop water over it, and then smell and taste the stuff that comes out. And if it smells and tastes the same, then you can probably use it the same in beer. Now, of course, you want to make sure that the extract and all that stuff from the malt COA is the same. But if it smells and tastes the same, if you're worried about smell and taste, and the malt changing, then you can do that. And that's a pretty easy, quick way for you to do that at home. You can also do that with yeast screenings, right? You can take a little bit of wort and then just pitch different yeasts in those little bit of wort and see how it's going to change. So those are really interesting, really easy ways. It's a little bit different with hops, especially if you're boiling with them, right? Because you're not going to be able to boil and change all that. But at least with yeast and malt, there are some home screenings that you can do to test differences from a sensory perspective.
Right. And I think, again, like I said with yeast, with malt, you're going to want to choose a similar malt. So if you're trying to make a German Helles and your homebrew store doesn't have Weyermann Pils, don't use Maris Otter. It's not the same thing, right? And on the flip side, if you're trying to make a English beer and they don't have Maris Otter, you can use pale malt and make a great English beer. It's not going to taste the same, right? And granted, I think that Brülosophy did an experiment and maybe they couldn't tell the difference.
Didn't taste the difference.
But let's be reasonable here, right? Like I think that local Pilsner malt versus European Pilsner malt, maybe it's a little different, but you're in the ballpark. But obviously, you wouldn't substitute roasted malt for European Pilsner malt. So be smart about it. But if you're in that kind of range with malt, it might be a little different, but it's still going to be a great beer.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're in the caramel ranges, right, the different color scales are going to change the flavor too, but you can substitute, right? Like it may not be a 1-to-1, it may not be a perfect substitute, but if you're trying to hit 80 and the only thing that's available is 60 and 120, you might try some blends of those. And they might give you that same flavor profile that the caramel 80 would give you. So there are options out there to think about, whenever you're trying to make malt substitutions. But again, back to the sustainability concern, if you can get winter barley varieties and you have access to those are going to be huge for sustainability concerns with respect to barley. And of course, support your local suppliers. If you have those and they're available to you, you can help by building that local supply chain to offload some of the costs and expenses on the global scale. But so this is pretty good, Jordan. I think we talked a lot about different ingredients, yeast, malt, hops, and how to make sustainability decisions and maybe substitute some of those ingredients. Is there anything else that you wanted to add?
I really think that substituting is part of the fun part of brewing, at least at the home scale, because it's like, it's like the chef that's not measuring any ingredients, right? It's like, oh man, I'm out of Vienna. I got Munich. Let's make a great beer instead with that. And so I really think that's part of the fun. And I really encourage people to make some, swaps on the fly and, see if you can make an even better beer that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, think about the sustainability impact that your brewery is having, right? Like, think about these different ingredients and make some decisions that maybe help everybody else out, or, help with climate change. And I'm not saying that these need to be like the focus. I mean, they can be. People are interested in chasing efficiency. It'd be interesting to chase sustainability too, right? And make the most sustainable beer that you can do. If that scratches the itch for you, that's something certainly to look at. But there are options out there. There are ingredient choices that you can make to improve the sustainability of your brewery. And like Jordan said, try some new spices, try some new ingredients, try your hand and see what happens whenever you switch up the malt, hops, or yeast in your next batch. All right. Well, Jordan and I will be back in 2 weeks with our next Applying the Science episode. We'll see y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brülosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brülosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brülosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/Brülosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.